What's up, friends? Dan Vega here, Spring Developer Advocate at VMware, and today we're going to be talking about creating a GraphQL API in less than 30 minutes. So the reason I'm doing this is I visited VMware Explore Barcelona last week. It was such an amazing trip. I've written about it on my newsletter. We'll jump into that in a second. But there I gave a couple of presentations, one of which was a live coding session on building a GraphQL API in 20 minutes. So I want to talk about that. But first, man, look at this backpack, this water bottle. I got a t-shirt with it. Very nice backpack. I'm very excited to use this. I tried to get another one so I can give one to you guys. I'm going to try to do better. I need to get some swag so that I can start giving away swag to you guys. I'm going to come up with a plan in the new year, and we'll see if we can't get some things out to you. But with that, you'll see this in the future, and actually I'll probably put it back there. So if you're paying attention, look back there. All right, so let's dive into this a little bit deeper. I'm taking you over to danvega.dev just to show you that in the newsletter section, if you have not subscribed to my newsletter yet, what are you waiting for? This is my weekly-ish newsletter, and it's really just a way to keep you up to date with everything that I'm working on. The last one that I wrote, you can read for free the last few ones if you want to, or you could subscribe and get them before anybody else does. But the last one was the VMware Explore 2023 recap in Barcelona. Again, it was just amazing. I had a couple presentations there. One about accelerating innovation with Spring, the anniversary edition. And this one I did with my coworker, Cora. That turned out really well. There's a recording of that if you want to watch that. Now, I also did a live coding session in the Code Theater. This is like an area where we can just write some live code. And it was a really cool area to be in. Really nice stage, really nice kind of environment. And this is the live coding area. So no slides here. This is just kind of my starter that I showed. And then we went into, again, 0 slides, all live code. Now, I only had 20 minutes. So I'm going to, and I actually rehearsed this a couple of times beforehand, and it ran a little bit long. So I'm going to give myself 30 minutes today for you guys. So we're going to do this today. We're going to do this presentation from there. I'm going to do a little bit longer form of it so I can include a couple other bits. But yeah, 30 minutes to learn how to build a GraphQL API, but we're going to build an entire application that contains data, and we'll talk about what some shortcomings of REST may be, like why you may want to choose GraphQL. So this is going to be fun. Yeah, and again, if you were in Barcelona at the McLaren meetup, let me know below. That was one of the coolest meetups I've ever been at. We just had so much fun in Barcelona. Can't wait to go back. So, hey, if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, please go ahead and sign up for free. With that, let's go ahead and write some code. All right, to get started, you're going to head over to github.com/danvega, VME blog, stands for VMware Explore. And this is the README that I used in the live coding session, and we're going to go through it because it has an agenda. It has the steps that you need to take, and we're going to walk through it. So agenda, we're going to create a Spring Boot project. We're going to configure Docker Compose to actually talk to a database, a real database. We're going to load some blog posts from a JSON file. We'll talk about that. That's coming from my new website over at danvega.dev. We'll create a post controller. We'll create the GraphQL schema. We'll talk about the custom scalar types that you might need to create when you're creating a GraphQL schema. Then we'll create the GraphQL controller to kind of talk about some of the things that it's going to fix versus REST. And then we'll introduce a new type called comments, which will kind of add some more capabilities into our application. We got to create a new Spring Boot project. You could head over to start.spring.io, fill in all the metadata that I've asked you to, fill in all the dependencies that you want. But Spring Initializer has this really great project where you can go in and share. So I could fill in all of the data that I want you to use and then share that. It will give you this link. If you open it up now, you could see it is using all the configuration that I need you to use. So we have Java, Maven, the latest release candidate of Spring Boot 3.2. We have our metadata. I'm using Java 21. You don't need to. We're not doing anything 21 specific here. But as far as dependencies goes, we're going to build out a web application. We're going to talk to a database using Spring Data JDBC. We're going to use the Postgres SQL driver. Because of that, we're going to bring in the Docker Compose support, which allows us to automatically create the Compose file by convention. We'll pick it up. We'll run it for you. We'll talk more about that in a second. Spring for GraphQL is the bits that's going to help us build GraphQL applications in Spring for GraphQL using a project called GraphQL Java. My two defaults should go to every single time. I just include them by default now. Spring Boot Actuator, Spring Boot DevTools, those are going to help you out. So with that, well, you can go ahead and generate a new artifact. I'm going to come on blog because I already have one called VME blog. I'm going to go ahead and generate that. It is going to create a zip file. I'm going to go ahead and open that up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ IDEA. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. All right, so if we go back to my README here, the first thing we want to do is configure Docker Compose. We got to configure the properties for the Postgres database and make sure to expose port 5432 on the host and container so that we can connect to it using our IDE and tools. So again, because we picked the Docker Compose module and one of the services it supports like Postgres, we got this compose.yaml file and it went in and created this service. So from a Postgres DB standpoint, I'm going to go ahead and change this to blog. Secret is fine. I'm going to name this user. And I've done a video on this in the past, but what we're doing here, the way that this is declared in the compose YAML file here is we are going to expose a dynamic port on our local machine and 5432 in the container because we don't really care, right? Except we do in this scenario because I want to connect to the actual database within my ID tool so that we could see the data in the database. So to do that, I need to make sure that we are using 5432 on both the host and the container. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I need to make sure Docker is actually running. You do need Docker Desktop to get this up and running. But again, if you don't want to use Docker Desktop, that's fine too. You could probably just go ahead and use an H2 database, nothing specific for this example. So with this in place, I'm going to go ahead and I want to open up my application and run this particular app. And we just want to make sure everything is working before we do anything else. So it picks up that compose file by convention, starts up that service, and everything is working. So this means that in my IDE, I can go ahead and connect to this database. So let's create a new data source for Postgres SQL here. And this is going to be, I think, username and password. So we're user, secret. The name of the database is blog. And again, we're on 5432. So I'm going to hit apply. OK. Looks like it's thinking and looks like everything connected fine. Now I don't have any tables, so we're not going to see anything in there yet, but that's okay. Really good start so far. So we have our application up and running. We configured Docker. We actually even connected to that database using the built-in database tools in IntelliJ. All right, so now I want to go ahead and load some blog posts from JSON. And I want to do this in a new file called source main resources data post.json. So if we go back to my blog that I was talking about, well, I have my newsletter. I also have a blog. I have a feed. I think it's feed.json. Let's see. No, I think it's off the root. There it is. So I can come in here and get a list of all of the blog posts that I've created. And I want to do that. I want to stick that in a directory here called data. And I'm going to go ahead and say new file. We'll call this post. I believe we said post.json. Let's go back to the README. Yes, post.json. And I actually have some IntelliJ Live templates for this because, again, I only had 20 minutes and I wanted to make sure that I got through everything, and I really didn't. So even the templates really helped me out there, but I'm going to use them here. So VME, I'm going to say, hey, go ahead and load those posts. So it's just going to load in that JSON data, starting with, I believe, the array. I didn't need the other data. So now I just have a list of blog posts. And this is a really good start. And now that I have the list of posts, I want to create a new post record to hold data from that JSON file. So we're basically representing a post in our system. To do that, I'm going to come in here and create a new package. I'm going to call this post. In there, I'm going to create a new Java class. We'll call this post. This is going to be a record. And yes, I'll just go ahead and paste that in here. So based on the post.json, we have things like URL, title, summary, date modified, date published, and author. Now, author and modified, I don't care about right now. Author is the same for everyone. But I have title, summary, URL, date published, and I'm using @ID and @version. So I don't have an ID in that post.json, but I'm going to create one so that I have a unique identifier. And @version is part of Spring Data JDBC. You can see we're pulling that in from Spring Data. And this is just to let Spring Data know how this is going to get wired up. This is the ID. This version helps with, hey, are we creating a new one or updating an existing one? So with our post in place, we're getting there. We need a post repository to be able to talk to the database. So I'm going to quickly create one of those. I'm going to say I need a post repository. This is going to be an interface. This is going to extend the list CRUD repository. The type is a post. The ID is an integer. All right, so we're getting there. Next, we need a bootstrap file. This is going to implement the command line runner interface. This is going to allow you to execute some code after the application has started. In this case, we're going to load JSON file, the JSON data, and save it to the database. So I'm going to call this bootstrap. I'm going to copy this. Let's go ahead and put this in the main package. So I'm going to say Java file bootstrap. Let's go ahead and paste this. We'll fix some things here in a second that need to be fixed. Let's go ahead and import that from Jackson. We'll fix that in a second. So I have this. It's implementing the command line runner. This is a functional interface. There's a single abstract method in there that we need to override, which is called run. And I'm basically using the post repository that we just created. And I'm saying, hey, if the count is 0, so if there's no records in the database, we don't want to do this every single time. What I want you to do is, from using an input stream, I want you to get that posts.json. So we're going to get that post, and we're going to use the object mapper, which comes from Jackson. This is there. This is a bean that's in the application context because we are using Spring MVC. Jackson's on the class path. Everything is there that we need. So I want you to use that object mapper and read it from the input stream. So all of that data. And I want you to map it to something called posts. Now, we don't have posts yet. So I could use something like just a node in Jackson to go ahead and do this. But I want to actually map it to a type. So I like coming in here. I'm just going to create a simple record called posts that is nothing more than a list of posts. And we'll call this posts. So now these two will kind of map up, and we get a list of posts back. In the logs, I'm going to say reading posts from the JSON data and saving it to the database. Here's how many we're going to save. I'm going to use the post repository and save all of the posts into the database. So now we're almost there. We're almost there to go ahead and read that in. But we need, when it comes to Spring Data JDBC, we need a table in place. And to get a table in place, I can do this by convention. I can come in here and say I need a schema.sql. This is what that table is going to look like. We are going to use an ID, title, summary, URL, date published, version, and the primary key is going to be ID. This is not H2, that's why it is complaining. So let's say Postgres, and this is going to get generated for us. So we don't have an ID in that post.json. We're going to create one in the database. So we're almost there. One last thing to do. By default, if this is an embedded database like H2, we'll automatically look for this schema.sql by convention. But because this is not H2, you need to be explicit and tell us to look for it and execute that file. So to do so, I'm going to set spring.sql.init mode equal to always. And with that, I think we can go ahead and try and run our application again. And if everything works, we should see the log message in here. And we do, reading 174 posts from JSON data and saving to a database. So just to be sure, we're going to come into our database here. We're going to refresh this. We see a table in here now, which is posts, and we see our 174 records. Awesome. So this is the kind of start that I had to this. We have the data in place, and this is important because a lot of the questions I get are, hey, how does a GraphQL API hook up to a database? And those aren't the questions we are asking, right? We don't ask that when it comes to REST. We don't say, how does REST talk to a database? No, a REST controller would delegate to some type of post service, or in this case, post repository for its data, and GraphQL is no different. So with that, now I think we can go ahead and move on to the controller bits. All right, so now that we have our data working, the next thing you could do is go through and create a post controller that is a REST controller. And you could do this to simply point out a couple of things. And I do this talk around the ideas of GraphQL and why you might want to reach for GraphQL. We don't have the time to go exclusively into that, but I'll post a link to a video, a presentation I gave at Spring 1, where we do get into a lot of the why and the what's. Here I'll just quickly show an example. We have this REST controller, and often in organizations we'll find that, hey, we get a lot of requests from other teams inside of our organization. Hey, I need a new method that looks like this, that will return the data like this, and that's what I need. Then someone else will come along and say, that is kind of what I need, but I need a slight variation of that. So we ended up creating like all these different endpoints to satisfy all the different clients in our organization, right? And this gets to be, this leads to a lot of code maintenance, because any code we write, we have to maintain, right? So that's one part of it. We're writing all these custom endpoints for all the clients, whereas in GraphQL, you have one endpoint and you say, hey, client, whatever you need as far as data goes, you can ask for it. Another thing that I like to talk about is kind of the fetching of multiple resources to get whatever you need on, say, a single page. So a good example of this might be on a products page. I can get one REST endpoint to get all of the data for that product. Then I might call another REST endpoint to get all of the related products to that product. Then I might call another endpoint to get all of the reviews for that product. So that is, hey, I need to call multiple resources to fetch all of the data I need for this particular template. So that is another problem. And yeah, just the overfetching of data from a REST standpoint. Maybe I'm on a mobile device. I only need 5 fields instead of the 40 that get returned on the desktop. So those are some of the issues with REST. Let's move on to GraphQL. So Spring for GraphQL takes a schema-first approach to building GraphQL APIs. This means we're going to define our schema using the GraphQL schema definition language. This is a human-readable format that allows us to define our types, queries, mutations, and subscriptions. We'll talk more about that. If you want to dive in and learn more about the schema, go ahead and visit this link. So let's just get back to the code and start to define our schema. So we're going to go into the GraphQL folder. We're going to create a new file. You can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it schema. It just must end in GraphQL-S. And now we get to start to define our schema. So the first thing that we start with is something called an object type. And these are going to represent the different objects in our system. So we start with the keyword type. And in this case, we want to represent a post in our API. On the left is going to be the name of the field. On the right is going to be the type. So we're going to start with an ID. The type is going to be ID. Now this is, as far as the GraphQL specification goes, there are 5 different built-in scalar types. There's ID, int, float, boolean, and string. So ID just represents something that is unique in our system. The exclamation point is saying, hey, you don't ever have to worry about null here. So if we go back to our our doc here, let's go ahead and copy and paste this in just so we know which fields we have. That should work. So I'm going to have an ID, a title, a summary, a URL, and a date published. And all of these are going to be strings. Okay, so you might be looking at this date published and go, that doesn't look like a string. That looks like something I might want to represent as a date. And you're right. So what happens when you need a custom scalar type? You could easily write your, well, I don't know about easily. You can write your own, but I would say pause there and go look around because there's probably a scalar type that we can use that you don't need to reinvent the wheel for. So we need a custom scalar type. How do we do that? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our pom.xml, and I'm going to add a new dependency. So let's say dependency GraphQL Java extended scalars. So again, Spring for GraphQL is built on GraphQL Java. GraphQL Java is where we are going to get the support for those extended scalars. So once we have that, now we can come back over here and we can create a new class called GraphQL config. So we'll say GraphQL config, and this is going to be a configuration class. And we're just going to wire in one of these extended scalars, which is the date. If you go ahead and look at that, there's a whole bunch of custom scalar types that you can use. In this case, we're just going to use date. So once that configuration class is in place, we can now define a custom scalar type in our GraphQL schema. So here I'm going to say this. Now when I come down to date published, I can say that this is a date. Okay, so we have our object type. The next thing we need to do is talk about operation types. So there are three special operation types in GraphQL. There is a, let's just go ahead and put this here. There is a query, a mutation, and a subscription. A query is anytime we want to read data. So I want to get a single post, I want to get all the posts. A mutation is when I want to change data or mutate data. So I want to create one, I want to update one, I want to delete one. A subscription is similar to a query, except it's a long-running operation. So think of your traditional stock ticker where you want to open a connection, leave it open, and keep reading data to get the updated data. That's a subscription. So we want to create a query so that we can read some data. So again, on the left side is going to be the name of the query. I just want to see what we named it over here. We decided to call it find all posts. So we're going to say find all posts is the name. What is on the right is going to be the return type. So in this case, I'm going to return 0 or more posts. That's what the brackets are denoting there. It's saying, hey, you're going to return a collection of these posts. From a GraphQL schema standpoint, we are done. That's it. We're ready to go. Now we just need to know that when someone calls the find all post query, what is going to get executed on the Spring side? How do we tie those two together? And that's where our controller is going to come in. So we're going to come in, create a new Java class. We're going to call this the post controller. GraphQL, Spring for GraphQL is going to be looking for controllers annotated with @controller, and then it will look for special annotations inside of this class. Now, to get the data out of the database, we need that post repository. So I'm going to say post repository. I'm just going to call this repository because I know I'm only going to have one. And we're going to get it through constructor injection. So the first method I might have is the ability to, and I don't need this to be public, the ability to get a list of posts. So we're going to say find all posts, and we're going to return whatever the repository's find all method returns. Now, when somebody calls this find all posts, how do we connect it to here? And actually, I'm going to rename this just so I can show something off. And this is where the annotations come in. And so we're going to use a few different annotations here. One is schema mapping. So schema mapping is going to take a couple of attributes here. And one is the type name. And the second is, it's not the field. Thank you, Copilot. It is the value. And so this will be find all posts. So this says, hey, what is the operation type? Remember, we talked about there being three special ones: query, mutation, and subscription. And then the value is, okay, what is the field name in the GraphQL API in the schema? So in the schema, it's called find all posts. Now this is a little bit verbose, and we can cut down on this. So there are specialized versions of schema mapping, one of which is query mapping. And so if we use query mapping, we can go ahead and pass the value in if we wanted to, but we can even cut down on this a little bit more. If we name our method the same as the name of the field in the schema, then we don't need anything else. So if we call this find all posts the same as that value, then we don't need to pass a value. So now this is going to tie that up to that schema. So this is really all we need to make things work. Now, normally you would have to go into application.properties and enable this thing called the graphical user interface. So you would have to say this is equal to true. This is redundant because I'm using Spring Boot DevTools, which has a bunch of sensible defaults, and that is actually one of them. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and run this, and we'll go back over to the browser as long as everything works, and that looks good, /graphical, and this is going to bring up this user interface here. Let's go ahead and start there. So one of the things I really love is you get this built-in developer experience. You get this really nice tool to kind of explore your queries. I don't like using the word test because it's not really a testing tool, right? But we get to explore the API and explore writing some of our queries. So one of the things I like over REST is when it comes to REST, you really have to have some documentation in place to figure out exactly what the API offers. And that's usually involves hunting down some team and talking to someone, and unless there's actually documentation in place. But because GraphQL has a statically typed API, we can go ahead and get some documentation right out of the box. So remember those root types, those operation types, query, mutation, and subscription. It's going to list those here. I can click on query, and I can see that there's a field called find all posts, which returns a collection of posts. And these are the fields that it returns. So I can start to type out query. And now as I start to type, if I get some IntelliSense, hey, find all posts is one of the fields in that schema. Great, that's what I want. But now I don't want to just select all of the data, and I can't. I got to be very specific with what I want. In this case, I will select it all, but I'm going to be specific. And as I start typing, again, I'm going to get IntelliSense because the schema is statically typed and we know information about the schema. So now that I've defined my query, I can go ahead and run it here. And this is going to return all 174 posts in the database because that's what we inserted from the JSON. So this is a great way. We were able to get all the posts, but how about the ability to get a single post? So let's go back in here, go back to our schema. We'll come back here and we'll say find post by ID. And the name of the argument is going to be an ID. The type is a scalar ID. And oh, by the way, it can't be null. If you're going to pass me something, you better pass me something. And what we're going to return from that is a post. So we can go wire this up back in our controller. Again, we're going to say at query mapping, we're going to return an optional of post because I know what that is what the repository returns. So I want to name it the same as that. So find post by ID. This is actually going to take an integer. And then the next question becomes, how do we map the GraphQL argument, which is ID, onto the method parameter here? And that's how we can go ahead and use another annotation called argument. If we drill into that, download the documentation and take a look at this, it says, I will bind a named GraphQL argument onto a method parameter. Okay. So with this in place, we should be able to go ahead and restart our application. All right, I'm going to refresh this because it won't show up if I don't. So now if I go in here and say find, we see find post by ID shows up. And again, I can say ID, title, summary, what was it, date published. But now I need to pass in an argument. So ID, and then I'm going to pass in a valid post, and I'm going to hit run and execute, and there we get our single argument, our single post back. So that's cool. That's a really good start to it. We are able to build out this controller. We tied it to our schema. Things are working great. Next, I want to cover how to add comments to our GraphQL API. We'll start by creating a new comment record. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, let's go ahead and create a new package called comment. And inside of there, I'll create a new Java class called comment. This is going to be a record, and we will, let's try and copy that again, Dan. And let's go ahead and paste it here. Okay, great. We have a comment. So in the case comments are not stored in the database and they're fetched through a REST API, you could think of this as an example where we might be getting data from another service in our organization. This happens often, right? This is an opportunity to talk about the new REST client in Spring Boot 3.2. I love talking about that. But in GraphQL Java, the data fetching environment provides access to the parent instance of the field. To access this, we simply declare a method parameter of the expected target type. For example, to access the post instance for a comments field, you can declare it like this. So what does this mean? This means that if I go back to my schema, in my post, maybe I have a field called comments, right? Which returns a collection of comments. How do we do that? We can just grab this and paste this in here. And this works great. Now, maybe if you went into posts, there'd be something in here like a set of comment. We call this comments. And maybe this is like pulled from a database somewhere, right? But not in this case. What if it's pulled from somewhere else? What if it's pulled from a REST service? So where does this field get resolved? Well, if we go back to our post controller and we go ahead and use this method that I've created here, we can go ahead and use the @schema mapping annotation. Now again, the name of the method is the same as the name of the field in our schema. So that is going to kind of tie those together. So now when you say, hey, post, give me your comments, and because there's a schema mapping annotation here, it knows to look for this method to grab that. So let me create a quick logger here. And now what we can do is we can say, hey, fetching comments for post, and then we use the post.title, because again, this is the parent of that field. So if we look at comments, the parent is a post, so it will accept that as an argument to this method. So now I don't have a REST client yet. I need one of those. So in Spring Boot 3.2, we can get one of those. This is just a REST client, and sure, I want to go ahead and use the JSON placeholder service, which is a public API where I can get a whole bunch of comments from. So I have a REST client now. I can make a call out to our REST client to /comments. I can retrieve it. I get a list of comments back. And then all I'm doing here is saying, yeah, that's fine. I don't care about that right now. There's like 500 comments in this REST call. I'm just filtering them down by the ID just to it's just an example of reaching out to another service to get this data. All right, so now if we go ahead and do this back in our application here, if we go back over to GraphQL, so we're using the ID one. Now I'm going to say, hey, also give me, oh, I got to refresh this. So always got to refresh. So for the comments, what do you want from the comments? I want the email, the name, and the body. So this will give us the comments for this particular post. I can hit execute, and then here's one, here's that post, and then here's that collection of comments. Here's an email, name, and a body for those. So that's just a way to kind of tie in comments. And then here, back in the, so I think that's really all I wanted to cover. And I didn't get to the comments part in the code theater at VMware Explorer. So if you were there, I hope this helps out. I have some sample queries here that we used in the graphical user interface there. If you want to go ahead and run those, some info about me and some notes that I had. So cool. Yeah, I think that's it. I hope, because this wasn't recorded, I wanted to get this out there, and for those that were in attendance and those that weren't in attendance. And so I hope this was just kind of a quick intro to GraphQL via live coding, no slides, just how to build out a simple API using GraphQL. If you want to learn more, I'll go ahead and put some links to some resources in the description below. As always, you can check out my channel. I have a bunch of resources on GraphQL as well. So, hey friends, if you found value in this, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.